The gunshot came before any word could save her. Officer Ryland Holt raised his weapon and fired directly into Dr. Celine Kane's chest at point-blank range. The sound cracked through the quiet space with a violence her daughter would never forget. The impact drove Celine back as if the air itself had struck her, tearing through the flag patch on her shoulder and breaking the promise of safety she had carried home from every battlefield she survived. Her hand slipped from her young daughter's fingers as the life she had fought so hard to protect began to drain across her uniform. Holt did not shout. He did not hesitate. He acted with the cold certainty of a man who believed he had the right to decide who looked like they belonged in a soldier's uniform, and who did not. His weapon stayed raised, even as the girl fell beside her mother, pressing her small hands against the wound, begging someone, anyone, to help. Celine fought to stay upright, but her body weakened faster than her will, and she collapsed to her knees with the stubborn dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to bow to injustice. The silver dog tag engraved with her classified code slid from her collar and struck the ground with a soft, final sound. A sound that meant far more than Holt understood as the girl clutched her mother's chest. Her thumb brushed the hidden stud beneath the metal plate. The click was quiet, but the signal it sent was not. Omega Sentinel had awakened. The moment the shot was fired, the world shifted in ways Holt never imagined. Celine had walked out of the Dallas Fouvé Medical Center only minutes earlier, exhausted from her therapy appointment, but trying her best to keep her promise to her daughter. She had told the girl they would stop for ice cream on the way home. A small ritual that helped soften the weight of memories she carried from her deployments. Celine's uniform was clean because she wore it only on days when courage felt thin, and she needed to remind herself of every life she had saved. She was not on duty. She was not a threat. She was a mother trying to reclaim one peaceful afternoon. But Holt did not see a surgeon who had patched up American soldiers under mortar fire. He did not see the woman who stayed behind during a collapsing shelter to save wounded Marines. He saw someone he decided did not belong, someone he chose to confront, someone he would later claim had moved wrong, even though she had not moved when he first approached. Celine shifted her body to keep her daughter behind her, a reflex sharpened across decades of combat medicine. She greeted him calmly, offering respect even before he offered hostility. She said, "I'm retired Army Medical Corps Colonel Kane," and handed over her identification with a steady hand. Holt flicked it aside without looking, as if her record, Her years of service, her sacrifices, all meant nothing. "Uniform looks brand new," he muttered. "Where'd you steal it?" The words cut deeper than he understood. Celine had worn that uniform when she treated wounded soldiers who cried out for their families. She had worn it when she held pressure on a young soldier's artery for what felt like an eternity. She had worn it when she saved the brother of Holt's own chief during a fierce battle overseas. But Holt saw only the story he brought with him, a story built on suspicion and entitlement. He ordered her to her knees. She refused because the child at her side needed her to stay standing. Her refusal was not defiance, it was protection. But Holt interpreted dignity as resistance and escalated with the reckless confidence of a man who believed consequences were for other people. The shot broke through the afternoon in a way that would replay in the girl's mind for the rest of her life. The force drove Celine backward, her hand reaching out instinctively toward her daughter, even as her strength failed. The girl dropped beside her, her small voice shaking as she called out, "Mom, stay with me," pressing her hands over the wound, the way she had seen her mother do for others. Celine tried to speak, but only a faint breath escaped, one final act of presence for her daughter. Holt stepped back, not out of remorse, but out of shock that his own anger had taken him this far. He looked at his hands as if the weapon had fired itself. He reached for his radio, fumbling for a version of events that could be defended. But the world was already moving faster than he could imagine. Because when the girl's thumb pressed the hidden stud beneath her mother's dog tag, a classified beacon sent a signal across a network built for only one scenario: the death of a sentinel through unlawful force. Omega Sentinel did not wait for confirmation. It did not request authorization. It did not warn the local police. It triggered the highest-level military response allowed on American soil when a decorated service member was killed through unlawful force. Cameras around the lot began shutting down in a synchronized blackout. Cell signals within the immediate area began to scramble. And miles south in an underground wing at Fort Cavazos, Colonel Julian Kane looked up from his console as the symbol tied to his sister's code began flashing. He had seen alerts before. None were this color. None were this loud. None were meant to be ignored. Back in the parking lot, the girl tried to lift her mother's head, whispering words that carried the weight of a child's first experience with irreversible loss. She looked up at Holt with a mixture of terror and disbelief, unable to understand why a man with a badge had done this to someone who spent her life saving others. Holt stood frozen, realizing too late that this was not a routine stop gone wrong. This was the beginning of something he could not control. Celine's final breath left her lips as the faint echo of rotor blades began to build in the distance. Too low, too fast, too coordinated to belong to anything local. The girl did not know what Omega Sentinel meant. She only knew she had done what her mother told her to do, if the unthinkable ever happened. If they ever kill me for my skin on American soil, Celine had once written, wait for the truth to arrive, then scream. And now the truth was coming, carried on the wings of a system that had been asleep for years, waiting for this exact moment. The consequences for Ryland Holt, for Chief Harlan Crow, for Mayor Evelyn Shaw, and for every hand that buried the truth, were no longer optional. Omega Sentinel was awake, and nothing would stop what would next. The moment Omega Sentinel activated, the response unfolded with the precision of a system built for only one terrible purpose. At Fort Cavazos, deep beneath a restricted wing few soldiers knew existed, Colonel Julian Kane stared at his console as the red alert pulsed with the unmistakable signature of his sister's code. Celine's identifier was not supposed to appear under the heading now flashing across his screen. Omega Sentinel Breach. Julian's breath tightened as he realized the alert could only be triggered one way. The system had been designed for catastrophic loss, for the death of an asset whose work and identity were so classified that her protection did not end with retirement. Omega Sentinel was not for rescue. It was for response. And it meant his sister had been killed in a way that violated every treaty, every protocol, and every agreement between the military and civilian authorities. Across the room, technicians looked toward Julian with the stunned silence, knowing that whatever came next would alter the chain of command across the entire region. Julian issued the activation command with a steady voice that betrayed nothing, even though every part of him was breaking. Initiate blackout. Dispatch sentinel teams. Lock camera grids. Airborne units. Launch. The words traveled through secure channels with a speed unmatched by anything used for routine operations. Within moments, every camera in the Dallas VA parking lot went offline, swallowed in a synchronized blackout that looked like a glitch to anyone watching from the outside. To those inside the system, it was a declaration. Omega Sentinel was fully awake. In the sky above central Texas, 3 black helicopters with no numbers, no insignia, and no visible navigation lights turned toward Dallas with a precision reserved only for missions labeled Eyes Only. Their rotors cut through the air with a low thunder that signaled the arrival of something the public was never meant to see. On the ground at the VA lot, paramedic Kai Rivera sprinted toward the body he recognized even before he knelt beside it. The moment he saw Celine's face, memories rushed back from her deployments. The day she saved his life with her bare hands when all medical supplies had been destroyed in a blast. He touched her shoulder, hoping to feel any sign of pulse, but her body told him the truth with a final, irreversible stillness. He noticed the Omega Medic Group insignia on her sleeve, a symbol he had seen only once during his own deployment. He felt the weight of danger settle across his chest as he realized he was not looking at an ordinary casualty. He pulled out his phone and recorded a short video documenting the blood, the position of her body, the girl's hands still pressed against the wound, and the empty stare of Officer Ryland Holt, whose gun remained raised even as help arrived. Kai's recording captured Holt's attempt to reach for his radio, but before he could speak, a dark vehicle slid to the edge of the lot. Two men in black suits stepped out with an authority that silenced the scene. They moved with a calm that signaled training far beyond local jurisdiction. One placed a hand on Holt's shoulder and said nothing, but the officer's expression shifted from confusion to fear. The man's presence alone was enough to make Holt lower his weapon without protest. It was not a request, it was a message. Holt looked into the man's eyes and realized he had already been removed from whatever story he planned to tell. The other operative walked toward the girl with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the severity of the moment. He lifted the trembling child into his arms as if she weighed nothing, wrapping her in a protective cloth that hid her face from the growing number of stunned officers arriving at the scene. The helicopter blades became louder, sweeping dust and fear into the air as the operatives stepped back. The crime scene tape flapped wildly in the rotor wash before snapping against the poles with sharp, rhythmic sounds. Reporters who had begun to gather quickly shielded their cameras as the wind forced them to look away. Julian's command center showed each step in real time. The blackout grid held steady. The operatives secured the child. The shooter was neutralized without force. Holt's access to his radio was already dead. His badge number removed from the network, his presence erased as though he never arrived at the scene. He stood motionless, unable to understand how the world had shifted beneath him so fast. Officers around him asked if he was all right, but he did not answer. The fear building behind his eyes was not about the shot he fired. It was about the realization that he had shot someone whose death triggered a system so powerful that even the police chief could not interfere. Kai Rivera stepped back as two more operatives lifted Celine's body with a reverence usually reserved for soldiers lost in combat. They covered her with a flag they carried specifically for Omega Sentinel extractions, a flag stained with history and sacrifice. Kai wanted to speak, to tell they she deserved more than a silent removal. But the look in their eyes told him they already knew. One operative paused long enough to nod at Kai, a silent acknowledgement of the video he had recorded before the suits arrived. A courtesy, a warning, a confirmation that nothing about this moment would remain in civilian hands. The helicopters landed in a synchronized formation that shook the ground. The girl was placed inside the first aircraft, strapped in beside a medic whose movements were careful and gentle, as if handling something far more fragile than blood and bone. She cried out for her mother, but the medic rested a hand on her shoulder and whispered words too soft for anyone else to hear. Holt stepped forward as if to object, but the nearest operative looked at him with a quiet finality that stopped him cold. The officer's world, authority, confidence, control, collapsed under that single stare. He reached once more for his radio, but it remained dead in his hand, stripped of purpose. The men loading Celine's body into the second helicopter did so with a precision that made every watching officer realize they were no longer in charge of the scene. They were bystanders, spectators, witnesses to a handover that carried the weight of military authority far above their rank. As the helicopters lifted off, the wind flattened the crime scene tape one last time. Officers shielded their faces from the force. Kai watched silently, knowing the video on his phone was the only unclassified record of what had happened. In the command center, Julian stood with his hands braced on the console, breathing through the weight of grief and duty colliding in his chest. His sister's death had activated a system designed to expose truth, eliminate interference, and protect whatever remained of her legacy. Omega Sentinel was no longer a protocol. It was now a storm moving across Texas with a single purpose. Nothing would stop it. Nothing would slow it. And for the people responsible for her death, the reckoning had already begun. Kai Rivera uploaded the short video that evening, hitting post with a steady hand, even though his stomach churned with the knowledge that nothing in his life would be the same after this decision. The first views arrived in minutes, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands. And by the next morning, millions of people had watched Officer Ryland Holt fire a bullet into the chest of a decorated army surgeon in front of her daughter. The video spread across every platform, amplified by veterans who recognized the insignia on Celine's sleeve, and civilians who felt a sense of outrage that pulsed through the country like electricity. Kai never added commentary. He did not need to. The image spoke with a power that could not be softened, justified, or denied. Meanwhile, the blackout around the VA lot had ended, but the damage was already irreversible. Reporters began tracing Celine's identity online, digging into publicly available records until they uncovered fragments of a career most Americans never knew existed. When classified files leaked onto independent servers that night, the fragments became a full picture. The documents revealed that Dr. Celine Sophia Kane had saved countless lives across her deployments, performed surgery in collapsed buildings while rockets fell around her, refused medical evacuation more than once, and once held a severed artery closed with her bare fingers until help arrived. She had been quietly awarded the Star of Valor, a medal rarely bestowed, and even more rarely discussed. The leak painted her not as a statistic, but as a hero whose final moment was caught on video in the country she served. Veterans flooded the internet with their own stories of her, naming her Doc Kane, Guardian Sentinel, the surgeon who stayed behind, the smartest hands in the desert. Each story added weight to the outrage, shifting the public mood from shock to fury. While the nation watched the video on screens across living rooms, buses, and break rooms, the young girl sat in a secure room on base with her stuffed bear held to her chest. Inside the bear, as Celine once told her, was a journal meant for a day she hoped would never come. The girl unzipped the seam and pulled out the folded pages, her small hands trembling. The letter inside carried her mother's handwriting, steady and clear. "If they ever kill me for my skin on American soil," Celine had written, "stay silent just long enough for the truth to arrive. Then scream." The girl read the line several times before placing the journal against her heart. A child understanding too soon that her life had shifted into something vast and irreversible. Her silence was not compliance, it was preparation. She watched the adults around her whisper into phones, trade files, and coordinate movements with expressions that carried the gravity of national consequence. She felt her mother's voice inside the words she held, and she waited. At the Dallas Police Department, Lieutenant Nora Vale sat in her office with her face lit only by the glow of her computer screen. She had been Celine's classmate in high school, the girl who used to sit beside her in chemistry and trade jokes about which colleges would take them farthest from their rough neighborhoods. Nora had chosen policing because she believed in serving the community. Celine had chosen medicine because she believed in saving lives. Their paths had diverged, but their friendship had not. When Nora watched the viral clip, her heart lurched as if someone had grabbed her by the throat. She pulled up Officer Ryland Holt's personnel file, which she had accessed many times over the years. Several brutality complaints hidden under insufficient evidence, multiple use of force violations quietly reassigned to training mishaps, internal investigations sealed under Chief Harlan Crow's directive, and then a previous incident. The one Nora personally brought forward with documentation and photos, buried in the system as though it had never existed. She realized Holt's violence was not a mistake. It was a pattern protected from the top. Nora opened her encrypted drive and began gathering every file she had ever tried to submit, every complaint she had ever signed, every video timestamp she had ever verified. She uploaded the entire archive to a neutral external platform with a single click. The files went live within the hour. Within minutes, reporters were reading through the documents, connecting dates, and identifying the cover-ups that had shielded Holt for years. By morning, downtown Dallas erupted. Protesters filled the streets with a determination that left no room for denial or delay. Signs bearing Celine's name were lifted alongside military patches from units she had once healed. Crowds chanted not only for justice, but for accountability across the chain of command. Veterans marched shoulder to shoulder with nurses, students, and clergy. The police line formed quickly, but officers found themselves staring at a public no longer willing to accept silence. City officials attempted to calm the situation by releasing a brief statement claiming the shooting was under review. But the public rejected the message instantly. They had seen the video. They had read the files. They knew what under review meant. It meant delay. It meant denial. It meant the truth buried under paperwork, just as it had been for years. Then, Kai Rivera, still shaken from the night before, posted a longer version of the clip from his body cam patch. The footage showed Celine's hands raised, her voice calm, and her daughter standing directly beside her at the moment Holt fired. It captured Holt's contempt, his refusal to look at her identification, and his complete disregard for the child's presence. The extended footage shifted public fury from outrage to something deeper: betrayal. If this could happen to a decorated surgeon, it could happen to anyone. Across the city, phones rang in offices with increasing urgency. Politicians scrambled to craft statements. Reporters fought for sources. Attorneys prepared for immediate litigation. And Chief Harlan Crow, sitting behind his desk in a room lined with plaques he no longer felt worthy of, watched as the foundations of his department began to crack in real time. He understood the consequences long before his staff entered with demands for statements he could not give. He had buried Holt's complaints. He had protected him. And now the country knew. As the morning stretched forward, Nora Vale stepped to a podium outside the department, her voice steady but firm, as she announced her whistleblower leak in front of cameras. She stated plainly that the department had suppressed multiple warnings about Holt, that she had personally attempted to report misconduct, and that leadership had chosen silence over accountability. Her words pierced the city like a second explosion. Meanwhile, on the secure military base, the girl sat with her mother's journal open in her lap as a colonel knelt before her. He told her in calm tones that the country now knew what happened. The truth had arrived. She closed the journal with a quiet resolve her age could not soften, and for the first time since the shot that took everything from her, she finally let herself breathe, because the world had begun to scream for her mother, and it would not stop. The young girl walked into the Senate hearing room with a calm that unsettled every adult who watched her take those slow, steady steps toward the microphone. She wore her mother's dog tag tucked under her collar, the same piece of metal that had awakened Omega Sentinel only days earlier. In her small hands, she carried the blood-stained rank insignia that had been removed from Celine's uniform during the extraction. She placed it gently on the table in front of the senators, her fingertips hovering over it for a moment before she pulled her hand back. The room held its breath as she looked up, her voice soft but clear as she said, "This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice." Her words struck with the kind of weight no child should ever have to carry, and yet she delivered them with a composure that made the senators sit straighter, as if recognizing the responsibility they had in front of them. Senator Thalia Reid leaned forward with a steady expression, ready to guide her through the questions that would expose not only what happened in the parking lot, but the years of misconduct beneath it. Reid had built her reputation on holding power accountable, and she saw in the girl the dignity and quiet fire Celine once carried on battlefields. The hearing cameras captured every second, broadcasting nationwide as the girl described how her mother identified herself, offered her military ID, and stood between Holt and a frightened child before the officer fired without warning. No dramatics, no embellishment, just the truth spoken with the clarity of someone who had lived through the moment. Senator Reid shifted to the data next, releasing years of records she and her staff had gathered from both public and whistleblower sources. She explained that under Chief Harlan Crow and Mayor Evelyn Shaw, a large majority of all misconduct complaints within the Dallas Police Department had been dismissed without proper investigation. She read the patterns aloud, each revelation unfolding like another page of a story the public was hearing for the first time. Excessive force complaints buried, racial profiling reports ignored, officers reassigned rather than disciplined, civilian footage overwritten, body cam malfunctions that occurred only when certain officers were involved. And the darkest revelation of all, Holt had been protected through every incident. His record cleared repeatedly under the signatures of Crow and his internal affairs captain. Reed displayed the sealed files Nora Vale had leaked, showing the pattern of violence stretching back nearly a decade. Each document shown on the screen carried the weight of a system that had chosen silence over responsibility, and each revelation tightened the grip of public outrage across the country. As the hearing continued, the Senate gallery filled with veterans wearing patches from Celine's units. They watched without speaking, their expressions firm and resolute. Many had known Celine, many had served beside her, and all understood the magnitude of what had been taken. When Reed announced that Holt would be taken into federal custody before the day ended, the veterans lowered their heads, recognizing the solemnity of the moment. On the streets outside, crowds gathered around large screens, watching the hearing live. Some held signs with Celine's name. Others held photographs of the flag she had worn. All waited for the accountability they had been denied for far too long. Back inside the hearing room, the final portion of testimony shook the nation. Reed called for the arrest of Officer Ryland Holt on charges including unlawful killing, civil rights violations, falsification of records, and aggravated endangerment of a minor. Cameras captured Holt in the brief moment before federal agents reached him. He stood frozen in the hallway outside the chamber, his face pale, eyes wide with the realization that the shield he had relied on for years had shattered. When the agents placed cuffs on his wrists, he muttered something no microphone picked up. But one agent later described it as a quiet plea that collapsed into a whisper. The walk down the corridor became a national moment, an image of accountability many believed they would never see. By midday, the video of his arrest had been viewed by millions. Holt's wife filed for divorce before the sun set, leaving a public statement that simply read, "I feared this day would come." While Holt faced the consequences, Chief Harlan Crow sat alone in his office, staring at the letter that had been delivered that morning. It was written in the steady hand of his younger brother, Corporal Nathan Holt, who had served alongside Celine overseas. Inside the letter, Nathan described the day Celine saved his life by refusing to evacuate after a mortar strike. She had carried him under fire, sealed his wounds, and demanded he hold on long enough to meet his newborn daughter. Nathan wrote that he owed his entire future to her courage. Then his words shifted, revealing his shame at learning what his brother had allowed. How Crow had buried complaints against Holt, covered evidence, and created the environment that led to Celine's death. The letter ended with a sentence that pierced Crow with more force than any reprimand. "You let the woman who saved me die under the shield you were supposed to uphold." Hours later, Crow swallowed a bottle of pills in his home, leaving behind a confession that named every internal cover-up, every manipulated report, and every officer he had protected despite misconduct. His death did not undo the damage he caused, but it opened the door for investigators to retrieve the truth he had concealed for years. Mayor Evelyn Shaw watched the hearing from her private office in City Hall, her face tight with the fear she had kept hidden for years. She had built her political rise on promises of law and order. But behind the scenes, she had accepted private security donations to bury cases that made the city look unstable. Celine's death had become the match that ignited the entire structure. As the Senate hearing closed, Reed ended with a sentence that would echo across the country. "The death of Dr. Celine Kane is not an isolated tragedy. It is the result of a deliberate system, and today that system begins to answer for its choices." The moment the gavel struck, the hearing broadcast cut to live footage outside the Dallas Police Department. Residents lined the streets, chanting Celine's name. Veterans saluted the image of her insignia displayed on the building screens. And as the nation watched, a sense of reckoning swept through Dallas, carrying the weight of justice that had been denied for too long. The girl sat with Senator Reed in a quiet room afterward, clutching her mother's journal. The senator placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, telling her, "Your voice changed the country today." The girl nodded quietly, the dog tag warm against her skin. She understood now that her mother's final words, written on the page, were not a prediction. They were a promise, and the world had begun to fulfill it. Mayor Evelyn Shaw's downfall began with a soft knock on her door, and a single envelope placed on her polished desk, an envelope carrying evidence she could no longer outrun. Inside were financial disclosures she had buried, private security donations disguised as community grants, and emails proving she had approved the suppression of multiple brutality cases, including the earliest complaints against Ryland Holt. For years, she had justified her decisions as necessary for maintaining public order, convincing herself that silence preserved stability. But now, the silence she cultivated had turned into a blade pressed against her own future. As national outrage swelled, journalists tore apart her record with the same precision she once used to protect it. Every platform replayed the footage of Celine's shooting beside charts outlining how Shaw's administration dismissed or delayed investigations that threatened her political image. The pressure crushed her carefully built persona. Her approval rating collapsed. Donors withdrew support. Even her closest advisors distanced themselves, hesitant to be tied to a scandal that now carried federal scrutiny. She tried to issue a statement, claiming she had been misled by those beneath her. But the public knew better. The documents Nora Vale leaked showed Shaw's signature on every buried case. Her political masks had peeled off, leaving only the truth. She had made a career by prioritizing her own survival over the lives harmed by her inaction. By the end of the week, she resigned. Escorted from City Hall through a back exit to avoid the cameras, she retreated to a rented home in the New Mexico desert, far from the power she once wielded, living under a name that now meant nothing in the world she abandoned. Her disappearance became a symbol of what silence ultimately costs: reputation, legacy, and the illusion of moral authority. Meanwhile, Ryland Holt faced a justice no one believed possible only weeks earlier. The courtroom was filled to capacity the day he was sentenced, not with jeering crowds, but with quiet veterans who carried a steady, unbreakable resolve. They sat shoulder to shoulder, representing every unit Celine had served. The judge read the charges with a calm heaviness, outlining each count of unlawful killing, civil rights violation, falsified reporting, and endangerment of a child. Holt stood with his hands cuffed, jaw trembling, as he listened to the consequences he could no longer escape. There was no plea for mercy, no attempt to argue justification. The evidence was overwhelming. The video Kai recorded played one final time before sentencing, the sound of the fatal shot echoing through the courtroom with a severity that made several spectators bow their heads. Holt's attorney kept his hand on the officer's arm, knowing there was nothing to be gained by protest when the judge delivered the sentence: life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Holt's knees buckled slightly, his breath hitched in a shallow gasp, the reality sinking in that the uniform he once hid behind now held no protection. The courtroom remained silent, not out of sympathy, but out of respect for the woman he had taken from the world. After the hearing, a guard handed Holt an envelope that had arrived at the courthouse earlier. Inside was a drawing made by the girl, sent through an advocate who believed he should see it. The picture showed an American flag torn down the middle, and beneath it were 3 handwritten words: "You broke it." Holt held the drawing for a long moment, the weight of those words sinking deeper than any sentence the judge could offer. While Holt's fate moved forward in the justice system, another chapter closed in grim finality. Chief Harlan Crow was laid to rest in a private ceremony attended by only a few people, none of whom wore the uniforms he once commanded. His death by overdose had shocked the department, though many quietly acknowledged that he saw no path forward as the truth of his misconduct unraveled. Investigators found letters in his home that confessed to decades of suppressed complaints, including multiple cases tied to Holt. His notes detailed how he justified his actions over the years, claiming he believed protecting officers from public backlash preserved morale and stability. But those words rang hollow to the families harmed by his silence. Crow's funeral was modest and quiet, conducted without honor guard, patrol vehicles, or a flag presentation. The department declined ceremonial observances, citing the severity of his admitted misconduct. Only his daughter, 2 cousins, and a few former colleagues attended, standing in a small half-circle as the minister read a brief prayer. There were no speeches, no praise, no recollections of service. His coffin was lowered into the ground with the same quiet finality that marked his final weeks. In the days following, the department announced a full audit of every decision he had signed across his career, making clear that his legacy would be revisited, not with respect, but with scrutiny. Across Texas and beyond, reactions continued to ripple from Celine's death. Veterans held vigils in her honor, gathering in silence before reading her service citations aloud. Nurses shared stories of working beside her in makeshift clinics overseas. Military journals published pieces detailing the rare level of courage Celine had displayed across her career, emphasizing the magnitude of talent and heart the country had lost. The phrase, "cost of silence," began circulating among community groups, referring not only to the silence of leadership, but to the culture that allowed officers like Holt to operate without consequences for so long. Families affected by police misconduct came forward with renewed courage, citing Celine's story as the catalyst that gave them strength to demand accountability. And across the nation, parents spoke to their children about the role of integrity, using Celine's name in conversations about bravery, sacrifice, and the cost of standing for truth. In a small, secure building on base, the girl sat with Julian and Senator Reed as they reviewed the next steps. Her face carried a mixture of grief and resolve, the kind seen only in children who had grown up too fast. She held her mother's journal in her lap, tracing Celine's handwriting with her fingers while listening to discussions. She was too young to fully understand, but too connected to ignore. Reed told her gently. Your mother changed the world even after she was gone, Julian added, and you helped her do it. The girl did not speak. She simply nodded, her grief shifting slowly into a quiet, steady strength. The nation was beginning to move forward, but something in her understood that her mother's story was not only about loss, it was also about exposure, accountability, and the danger of silence. And in her small, steady heartbeat, the world could feel the first embers of the legacy Celine had left behind. Major General Elias Thorne stood before the cameras with a solemn weight in his posture, a weight earned over decades of service and quiet battles fought in rooms the public never saw. And when he removed his uniform coat and placed his stars on the desk in front of him, the nation understood that something irreversible was taking place. His voice carried the steady cadence of a man who had lost soldiers under his command. But the tremor beneath it revealed the personal grief he carried for Celine Kane, the surgeon who had once saved his life after an explosion overseas. He looked directly into the cameras and stated, "We will no longer train alongside any agency that treats our people as threats." The sentence rippled across the country with a force that silenced every commentator and left military leadership stunned. Thorne continued, outlining the painful truth he had kept quiet for years. That too many service members returned home only to face suspicion and danger on the soil they defended. He spoke Celine's name with reverence, recounting the night she held his chest closed with her own hands while waiting for a medic unit to break through the chaos. If she had died overseas, he said softly, it would have been an honorable loss. But she died here at home because those sworn to protect failed to recognize the very people who protect them. His resignation was immediate, his stars left on the table as a sign of protest. And by the end of the broadcast, millions of Americans were calling it one of the most powerful acts of moral courage in recent memory. In Washington, the Department of Defense moved faster than anyone expected. A coalition of senior officers, senators, legal advisors, and veteran advocates drafted a directive that had been buried in classified proposals for years. Now, in the wake of Celine's death, the directive resurfaced as an urgent necessity. It became known as the Omega Directive. The policy outlined a simple but radical protection. If a veteran or active duty service member was unlawfully attacked by civilian authorities, they were authorized to respond with immediate force to protect themselves and any civilians present. The directive did not undermine civilian law enforcement, but clarified that military personnel would never again stand defenseless in the face of unlawful violence. The language was firm, precise, and backed by decades of cases in which veterans had been harmed during routine encounters. The signing ceremony took place behind closed doors, but Senator Reid later referenced the moment in a press briefing, describing it as a safeguard carved out of the blood of someone who gave everything for this country. The directive passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, turning Selena's death into a legal and moral turning point. Across bases nationwide, commanding officers gathered their troops to explain the new protections, many speaking Selene's name in classrooms and auditoriums as an example of why the directive mattered. At the same time, communities across the country began calling for reforms inspired directly by Selene's legacy. Hospitals created new protocols for responding to veteran crisis. Police departments introduced mandatory military awareness training. State legislators drafted bills requiring independent oversight when a service member was involved in any police encounter. Veterans groups organized panels where military families could speak openly about fears they had carried for years. In these meetings, one name appeared again and again: Selene Kane, the surgeon whose death had forced a national reckoning. Her story became a symbol of both the fragility and the strength of those returning from war. A reminder that sacrifice did not end at the border of a conflict zone. While legislation moved forward, Julian Kane carried the burden of grief alongside the responsibility of shaping how his sister's legacy would be honored at Fort Cavazos. He established the Selene Kane Scholarship, a full-ride program offering opportunities every year to military children from underrepresented backgrounds. The scholarship became one of the most rapidly funded programs in Texas history. Veterans, families, and community members donated from across the nation, leaving messages describing how Selene's story had changed their understanding of service and sacrifice. Some wrote about their own fears as parents of children in uniform. Others wrote about the quiet courage of the soldiers they had known. Julian read every message, his heart heavy but strengthened by the knowledge that Selene's life continued to reach people far beyond her final moment. On the day the scholarship was announced, the girl stood beside Julian, holding her mother's folded flag to her chest, her chin lifted with the quiet strength Selene had taught her. A reporter asked her how she felt knowing the scholarship bore her mother's name. She answered softly, "It means other kids will grow, because my mom believed in hers." The room fell silent, and even the cameras seemed to record with gentler movements. Across the country, police departments felt the ripple effect of the reforms. Some resisted the changes, arguing that they threatened authority. But most departments quickly realized the tide had shifted. Cities that once ignored misconduct now faced demands for transparency. Police chiefs who refused reform found themselves pressured to resign. Members of Congress introduced oversight measures, tying federal funding to departments that implemented veteran safety protocols. And as politicians debated the finer details, the public remained united behind one truth. The death of Dr. Celine Kane had revealed a dangerous gap between military service and civilian policing, a gap the country could no longer afford to ignore. Major General Elias Thorne, now a civilian living quietly outside Fort Cavazos, received letters daily from service members thanking him for his resignation speech. Some wrote that his words had restored faith they thought they had lost. Others said they finally felt acknowledged by a system that had overlooked their struggles for too long. Thorne read every letter with a sense of responsibility he refused to take lightly. He never regretted stepping down. To him, the stars were symbols of authority, symbols he no longer wanted, while a soldier he admired lay buried because her own country could not see past its prejudice. He kept one object on his desk, a photograph of Celine standing in a field hospital, her hands covered in dust, her eyes steady with that familiar look of quiet determination. Below the frame, he placed one of his stars, not as a display of rank, but as a tribute to the woman who had earned his loyalty long before he wore them. The reforms, the directives, the hearings, and the public outcry all shared one unshakable truth. A nation had been forced to confront its failure, and in doing so, it began to change. Celine's name was now spoken in military halls, legislative chambers, classrooms, and kitchen tables. Her sacrifice had become a guidepost, a reminder that justice does not arrive on its own. It must be demanded, shaped, and carried forward. And though she was gone, the movement she inspired continued to grow, rooted in the belief that a soldier's life carried value not only on distant battlefields, but at home, where they deserved the same protection they once offered the country. In the time that followed, the shot that changed the country, the induction field at the West Texas Military Academy stood filled with hundreds of cadets standing in formation, each one wearing the crisp uniform of a young person preparing to serve. And at the center of the field stood the girl, holding the folded flag that once rested on her mother's casket. She stepped forward with a composure that drew the eyes of every student, instructor, and officer present. The commandant invited her to address the assembly, but she did not speak right away. She placed the flag carefully on the wooden podium, rested her hands against the edge, and lifted her eyes toward the cadets with a quiet strength far beyond her years. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, carrying the weight of grief, memory, and growth. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to ask this academy and everyone listening to give 1 minute of silence for someone who served this country with everything she had. The field, the officers, the watching families, every person within hearing distance fell into immediate stillness. No murmurs, no shifting feet, no wandering eyes. The silence felt like a living presence moving through every row, binding them together in a moment too heavy to ignore. The girl closed her eyes, pressing her thumb lightly against the dog tag beneath her collar, the same hidden stud she had pressed on the day her mother died. But this time, the gesture was one of remembrance, not survival. The minute stretched on, long enough to let the weight of Celine's sacrifice settle into the hearts of everyone present. And when the minute ended, she opened her eyes and spoke into the stillness with a clarity that carried across the entire field. "For those who protect us," she said, each word rising with a strength that felt larger than her small frame. And without hesitation, hundreds of voices answered as one, "For those who protect us." The sound rolled across the grounds with a power that struck even the most senior officers with emotion. After the call echoed into silence, she continued speaking, her tone calm, but grounded with purpose. She thanked the Academy for honoring her mother's name, but she also spoke of what came after, how the country had changed, how lives were saved, and how reforms were born not from anger, but from truth. She talked about the scholarship bearing her mother's name, about the children who had already received full rides, and about the letters Julian had read to her from families Celine's legacy had touched. She spoke of Major General Thorne leaving his stars on the desk, of the directive signed in her mother's honor, and of the veterans who wrote to her saying Celine gave them hope even after her death. She did not cry as she said these things. Her voice never wavered. She carried herself the way Celine once taught her, with dignity, gratitude, and unwavering clarity. When she finished, the commandant stepped forward and saluted her, a gesture normally reserved for military personnel, and the cadets followed with a united salute that turned the moment into something sacred. She returned the salute with a small nod, knowing her mother would have told her to stand tall and accept the respect she had earned. Later that afternoon, she walked with Julian to a quiet room inside the academy where she had been asked to sign a commemorative plaque bearing Celine's photograph and service timeline. The plaque would hang in the academy's Hall of Honor. She signed her name beneath the inscription that read, "In memory of Colonel Celine Sophia Kane, a protector at home and abroad." She pressed her palm gently against the glass frame for a moment, whispering words only she could hear. Julian stood behind her, hands clasped, allowing her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel. When she turned back to him, her expression carried the same quiet bravery Celine used to wear on the long nights overseas. Julian placed an arm around her shoulders, telling her that her mother would be proud. And she leaned into him for a brief second before stepping forward again. She had learned that grief does not vanish. It reshapes itself into something a person learns to carry. Celine's legacy continued to deepen. Her photograph, the one titled The Triangle, showing the girl clutching the folded flag in the shape of a perfect triangle, hung in every American military installation. Beneath it, a single line was engraved: "Never again." The image had become more than a photograph. It had become a promise. Soldiers saluted it before deployments. Veterans touched the frame during ceremonies. Cadets studied it during ethics classes. It held the weight of a nation's vow to protect its own protectors. And though it was only an image, it carried the force of a movement born from the life and death of a woman who had given everything she had, even in her final breath, to shield her child. As evening settled at the academy, the commandant invited the girl and Julian to a small gathering with instructors and scholarship recipients. They spoke quietly about their goals, their families, and the new opportunities Celine's scholarship had given them. Many of the students told her they wanted to serve because of her mother's example. She listened with a solemn politeness, her eyes bright with the understanding that Celine's story was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to the country. When the gathering ended, she returned to the field with the folded flag in her hands. She stood alone for a moment, looking out at the empty rows where the cadets had stood earlier. She whispered, "I did it, Mom." Then she lifted the flag to her chest and took a deep breath. The lights across campus dimmed, and Julian called to her gently, but she asked for one more minute before leaving. She bowed her head in quiet reflection, letting the still air settle around her, carrying her mother's memory with a tenderness shaped by the time she had endured. When she finally walked toward Julian, she did so with a confident stride, as if every step carried a piece of Celine's strength. The country had changed, laws had shifted, leaders had fallen, but none of it compared to the legacy that moved forward in the small frame of a child who learned to speak truth in a world that once refused to hear it. And as she left the field with Julian beside her, the story of Dr. Celine Sophia Kane lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a turning point carved into the heart of a nation determined to honor those who protect it. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps.